Hey guys, Christic here. So today what I'm going to start working on is OpenAPI documentation. Now this will be part 9 of my user services series. And what I'm going to dig into here is how we can make better documentation for our API. In order for an API to be successful, that documentation is a paramount of importance. If your users don't know how to use your API, it's going to be very difficult to sell them on why they should, in fact, use it. So, what we need to do is develop out documentation that supports what our API does and how a end user can consume that. So, let's take a look at what Swagger has produced for us out of the box. Now, at the moment, we're using our generic API on one of our controllers, and on the other side, it's a essentially a generic API, but it is using a self-contained model. So let's have a look at our Swagger documentation. Now, Swagger does a really great job of producing a UI that works with our endpoints, and I think it's fantastic for doing a lot of great things. There are certain things that it has some deficiencies for, and these are things that you have to almost manually implement. So let's take a look here. So we have companies endpoints and companies 2 endpoint. Companies 2 in particular was for using our generic API. So I'm going to go off using our generic API for a moment. So the get statement or get method really just is there to return all entities. And what it shows here isn't very valuable to an end user. It does, however, show that there's a response of 200 if successful. That's okay, but it doesn't really tell much in the way of context around what that user should be expecting. Now, you'll find as well that in the post statement and pretty much every other statement, it does the same thing. When we look at each method, they all respond in the same way, which isn't actually true. They don't just respond with an OK, they actually respond with data in many cases. For the post, for example, it responds with a created status, which is 201. So I have to make some modifications so that we actually get the right parameters, request body, responses into this UI. Now it's not complicated, but it does require a little bit of work. So let's give some thought to this. We'll go back into the API and we'll start thinking about how we can make these changes. Now, one of the things that I can do, and Swagger does a really good job at picking up the majority of things that are important for the API, and or at least for the commentary around it. So if I do the XML comment style, that is the 3 dashes above my method, I can provide a summary, parameter information and return information, similar to what we've done in any great C# program. Pretty much any other language as well. You can provide more commentary about what each method function actually does. And in this case, we can provide some generic information here. So we can say that this creates an entity. So simply it just creates an entity. If we go too deep, we start to lose context of anything that's inheriting it. Okay. Now, if I really wanted to be specific, I could basically override this method in a higher level and provide more context specifically around the the entity type that is using it. So, for example, if I'm doing company, I would provide a summary of creates a company. So simple like that, but that would be really that's a lot more work that we're really interested in doing. So we're going to try to provide a more mechanized approach, which is essentially why we do a generic controller, is because we have more predictable features that can be made available to our controllers. So we've got our summary. Let's look at parameters. Now, the parameter in this case is just going to be request body for post method. Fairly straightforward, again, very generic. And then returns is a created entity. Okay. Now the other things that we want to provide is information around the types of response that come through. Now, in terms of response, a response code of 200 would mean it's successful. Success. Now, one of the things that we understand about post, however, is that it doesn't return a 200, it returns a 201. So we could simply go ahead and add 201 created. Now, there isn't any extra other types of response codes that are available on this. However, if I copy this down, and let's go over to here. We're going to do this. So we're going to modify the comment for the get with an ID. Okay, so the ID is an ID of an entity. Okay, and the summary is get an entity by ID, returns single entity. Okay, and then response, this is where a response is 200, and it is a success response. Still fairly straightforward, nothing too complicated. The next one will be get, and it gets all entities, and it does not have a parameter, and all entities. Okay, and it also produces a response of 200. So let's look down now towards the put statement. Now, a put statement is an update, so it will update an entity by ID. Okay, and it returns an updated entity. It also returns a status code of 200, but you'll notice it also has the opportunity of returning a bad request. So bad request is 400, and we can say that it returns a bad request just like that. Now, there are also other features here too, so why don't we just finish up by filling in that. We also have param for ID, okay, and ID of an entity. Okay, I think that's got that pretty well handled, but yes, we need the param for value. It's giving us doing a good job at telling us these things. So this is the request body for put. There we go. All right. So we have our get, post, and put filled in. Now we want to fill in our delete. So we say delete an entity by ID, returns nothing, and it returns two things that it returns. It returns a not found and a bad request. So not found is 404. And just like that. All right. Now, I think that we are pretty good. So returns doesn't really return anything. It just returns whether it's okay. If there's no, it doesn't tell you anything about what it returned. It just says that it was successful. All right. So there's a couple modifications that we need to do to make Swagger actually recognize that we're using these XML comments. And one of them, the changes that we have to make, start in the project file, and we have to add in the generate documentation file. We have to specify that that is a true value, so we can close that now. Next, we need to go into the program under where we've added Swagger Gen, and we can add an action here. Now the action is C, in this case C XML comments. Now XML comments requires a parameter, and the parameter is a path to a file. Okay, that file is the documentation file that is being generated, and as long as we provide the path to that file, we can work with it. So if I do I'm going to generate this file path, and to do that, we're going to pull from the assembly dot get executing assembly dot get name, okay, dot name, and give it a file extension of XML. The next thing here is we need to combine the path, and we have the app context. Now, the app context, what we need here is where is that base directory going from. So we can combine the base directory and the file name together, and that way it gives it a path to that XML file, and it can now include those comments. So if you remember what we had before, we didn't have a lot of description around the information that we were trying to accomplish here in our generic controller. So let's go ahead and try it out. We'll see what Swagger now produces. All right, so let's take a look at Swagger. We can easily get to it like this, and we now see that we have a little bit more commentary around what our companies 2 API does. So let's have a look here. So we have get all entities, creates an entity, gets an entity by ID, update an entity by ID, and delete an entity by ID. Now, we don't have a lot of extra stuff in here, but one of the things that I do have is this extra 200 success. There isn't much way of getting rid of that at the moment, the way we're doing it. So once again, this is why we have to expand out on more options for modifying things like examples, descriptions, summaries, response codes. All those things are really key. One of the things that I want to also explore is, once again, providing the summary and description around what this actually does, but also looking at the request body. You can see that the JSON document type, and I'll go back over to our API here. Let's look at the post. All right, so it requires a body of JSON document. Now, JSON document is essentially a string. So it's reporting a string, which is correct. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But it doesn't provide a whole lot of context or value around what a user would actually give to the system or to the API to actually make it work. Right? Now, we know that a company only requires a name in this case. So when I give it a name, it should work just fine. Okay. But if I don't know, I really have no idea what to do with this. So we're going to provide some contextual examples next. All right, let's take a look at what else we have here. Um, Also, some of the parameter detail, it's a little limited. Not bad. It is taking our parameter information here. It says ID of an entity, and if you recall, that is up here in the get area right here, ID of an entity, and that's where this description is coming in. So it is doing that just nicely. But we're still not quite getting all the detail that we have. Now let's move down to schemas. Schemas has a lot of detail here for things that are probably not necessary for what we're trying to accomplish. These are all models that are related to the identity services here that Microsoft provides. So they are valuable, they are useful. Microsoft gives some examples of how things work. So for example, they provide an example value if I want to resend a confirmation email. They are providing responses. Forgot password, here's how I send it again. So I just have to send an email and then it'll actually send me the email for that. It also provides a really nice feature for responses. So if I look at the response of 200, it says success, but if I have a response of 400 bad request, it also sends me more detail about what actually happened. And there's a lot of value in doing that. They have a return type for this type of of this um, problem, and that's very valuable. We're not going to be talking about that type of return type at the moment, but you kind of get the idea that even the responses has examples of what should come back, and again, there's a lot of value in that. As well, when we look at their info, they've got an example of what comes back as a success. And once again, they have their bad request. They also have their 404 not found. And going to post, it tells us what should come in from a request body, and then if successful, here's what is returned, so on and so forth. So I think you kind of get the idea. Um, they also have this area here, so this schema, in this case it says it's an info response, which is down here. I can easily look through this and decide how I would determine what features info response actually uses, and I can consume that information quite well. So let's have a look here. Now, how do we actually make this work? Well, we have to expand out and use something called an operation filter for Swagger. Now, an operation filter in this case um, is not terribly difficult to build, but we're going to build it out slowly here. So I'm going to put all my filters in a filters folder, and in particular I'm going to create a namespace for Swagger. So we'll build a class, and this class I'm going to call entity request body examples. Request body examples. And actually I want to call it request body examples filter so that it can be a little bit more descript. All right, and we're going to inherit the operation filter from Swagger. All right, so with this, what I can start to do is I can apply generically throughout the entire set of API calls. I can just say, here's the description. So let's go ahead and just go ahead and make that happen. Okay, so I'm going to provide a summary. That summary is the one that appears on the line, by the way, in the UI. I'm just going to say, let's do summary for, oh, okay, and going to give this a little context around the method that's going to be called. Okay, so with that very simple change, I'll push out a summary for every API endpoint and its methods. So in order to make this operational, I actually have to add it over here in our Swagger Gen area, and we're going to add in an operational filter. So this is entity RequestBody filter. And if we run our application right now, we're going to see some changes in Swagger. So let's go ahead. All right, let's have a look at Swagger. And now we have an enhanced UI that has the description or the summary that we've provided throughout. We haven't made any other changes, but we do now have summary as the summary line there. And that's going to be really valuable once again for our users, because we want to be able to tell them what happens here. Why do we have this this endpoint? So now let's go back again here. We'll make some more changes. The other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a change to the description, just so that you can see this. Now, one of the cool things about this field is that it uses the common markdown language for defining what this field looks like. So I can use a lot more formatting on this. So one of the things I like to do is I like to talk about things like requirements. So looking at requirements, I might want to say that, let's say requirement 1, okay, and then of course requirement 2. All right, so that should work, and by putting this little dash there, that's going to produce a bullet list. I'm going to look at the next thing. I'll show you that you can also do numbered lists in there. You can do more formatting. There's a whole lot of other things that you can do, but it's really up to you how you decide on that. So let's look at our Swagger again. If I go in here, I now have requirements 1, 2, and of course by doing that, now I've got more context yet again around what's necessary to make this thing start to work. So for example, I might have requirements or more description here that explains that, for example, the ID parameter and the ID of the request body have to match in order to function properly and move to the second stage of updating an object. All right, so the other thing that I might do, and I mentioned this before, is I'm going to also combine these things just to demonstrate the next step. All right, now I mentioned I would put in some numbering here, just like that. And that means I'll take away just a couple things here. Now what I did is I just simply took the summary that we had in the summary level, pushed it down into the description so it can combine things. Now you may be asking, well, why are you bothering to tell us all of this? But I want to show you the depth that we can go to add more context for our description, because the summary is exactly that. It doesn't have to say a lot, but a description should be a lot more information, and it can be a lot more information. So let's have a look here. So now we have a numbered list. You see I put the one with the bracket, and it converted that over to a numbered list. So some pretty handy stuff there again, and that can be, once more, very useful. Okay, let's add some context now. So the next step here is we want to provide a little bit more context around what's the response body as an example here. So when we look at the response body, we have or not response body. The next thing we want to look at is the request body. Now the request body is where we start providing examples. For request body, it is an OpenAPI request body type. And when we look at parts of the request body, we have a few things. We have content, which is going to provide our example, a description of that example. Extensions are not necessarily important for what we're doing. A reference here is referring to the schema model, and that's going to also be fairly important. And then whether something is required, and whether it's an unresolved reference as well. So this is something where reference may not be in the schema. So let's have a look at the content. Now content requires as well a few things here. Now content is essentially a dictionary, okay? And it's a dictionary of media types. So media types meaning, in this case, we have application/JSON. This is how it's referred. So if you have a text request type, for example, you could supply what does a text request look like as well. Now, in that case, we also have a few features that we need to consider here. One is the schema. The schema is the part of the example that relates back to that schema area of Swagger. Now we're going to design the schema in a moment, so I'm just going to place null there for a moment. But we also have example. An example is an OpenAPI string, and that OpenAPI string is fairly basic, and I'm going to show you an example of that in a moment. But before we do, we have to generate the schema. Now the schema can be generated quite easily, and it has to have a concrete type. So we're going to just use our company as an example of a concrete type. So we have, schema generator dot generate schema company. All right. Now the next step here is we're looking at the context, is where does it come from? So that's going to be the schema repository. Okay. And now we set a few other things here. We're going to set what that reference is, so that we can make a hard reference to an object in the schema stack. So we have we have OpenAPI reference. And in this case, the ID is, now it only has to be the ID or the name of the object, so that's not very complicated. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a little variable because I know that I'm going to use it later. I'm going to call this generic type. Okay, and that way I can just refer to this over and over. So I do this dot name. So it's generic type dot name, and I'm going to refer back to this in a while. So let's say that this is a type of reference type schema, so it's going to refer back to the schema document area. So now we can simply add in schema for where the content of the request body comes from. And next I'm going to add in a description. Now the description will be a little bit less generic than the upper level description, because now we're talking about request body. So we're going to say the request body of type generic type.name for, and then we'll again provide the context, API, description, HTTP method. Okay. And we don't need the semicolon at the end. Now, for the example, the example is just a JSON example. If you are doing a different type of media type, you would specify how it looks in that media type. So with this, I can very easily add in a example. Okay, my example will look like this: example and example value. So it's just a string representation of JSON, and we will get a little deeper into this, but I want to just get it up and running so I can show you what this example actually looks like. Okay, go into our Swagger documentation. And let's take a look at something like a post, for example. So in this case, we now have a description of what the request body looks like. We also have an example and what schema it relates to. That means that if we look down to the schema areas, we now can see that we have a company schema and an application user schema. Now, something to note, there are oftentimes when a schema is developed, it pulls in features that we may not need the user to see. So, for example, whenever we are adding a company to using the API, they don't need to know anything about the user or user ID. Okay, and later on we're going to develop some schema filters that will actually remove some of those parts. Same with the application user. The user never has to know almost all of these things. They might need to know their username, they might need to know their email, or a list of companies, but they really don't need to have the rest of it in order to make the majority of calls work. So we could even remove application user altogether, but it is helpful to have a few things to work with. So let's go back over to our code here. Now, we wanted to make things a little bit more specific. We also want to look at contextually how does it relate to each type of HTTP method. Okay. Now, when we look at it, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a switch statement just around the HTTP method. We've done that before, so we will continue. And, oops. Okay, so let's think about what this does. So we have a get statement that we can respond to, and put, post, delete. Actually I'll put post first just because that's where we have it in our API. Delete, and then default. There we go. Break again. Okay, now when we think about this, we're going to produce some examples based on the context of what's coming through. Now, a request body for a get isn't necessary. So we don't actually have to produce any examples here. So what I'll do here is we'll call this JSON example request body. We'll just create a variable for this. It's going to start off as string.empty. So if I make a change to that example for this choice here, my example, once again, I don't need to add a whole lot of detail to this. So, and we're thinking again in the context of a company. So in this case, I want ABC Corporation. Okay, so now the example that will come through for a post will be slightly different, and I'm going to add it in just like this. Okay, now over here in put, I need to add a little more context here too, and it's this one I need an ID. So, and you'll see me just using the 3 dots for the ID. I don't need to be any more complicated than that. Next is if we don't have an example, then we don't need to produce an example. Okay, so if the example is not empty, then let's go ahead and produce the example. Okay, so for post and put, we do have examples. So we've given some more context around what each function requires here. So a post requires a name, a put requires a ID and a name. So let's go ahead and see what happens now. All right, we'll go into our Swagger documentation. So get has no request body anymore. Post has a request body, and it tells us exactly how to use that. And then put also has a request body and tells us exactly how to use it. We still have a nice schema the way it's expecting to be. And once again, I will be looking at some of these other features later on. The next thing that we want to address is ensuring that we always have the right type being used. Now we're forcing a type of company, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So what we're looking at here is we're just saying it's a type of company for all of them, and that's not correct. That will definitely never happen for any particular reason. So let's have a look at what's the next step here. In this case, we want to consider how our API is developed at the start. So we have these generic arguments at the start. We know that T is a type of user entity or iUser entity. Given that, what we need to do is we need to ask for the generic argument from this controller that has an interface of iUser entity. Now, again, the benefit of using a generic controller is that because we can have predictable information coming back, we might have 50, 100 different endpoint controllers that are spawning from this generic controller, which means that we can very easily generate documentation for all of those endpoints without having much disruption in finding how to use them or how to document each endpoint. So every endpoint will automatically have the same documentation by using this. And that produces consistency, and that's again great documentation for your end user. Now let's take a look here. So we want to look for the interface type. Now the interface type is going to be a type of user entity. Okay, and because we don't know what the T user key, or T key is, we also don't really care what it is. We just need to know that it's a type of user entity. Whatever types are behind it, it doesn't matter. Okay, the next thing that we want to look for is the actual generic type that we need to find. Now we have to use a little reflection on this. So we can look for generic type, and in order to do that, we can dig into the context and look at the method info that we're working from and find the declaring type. It's a nullable. We can get the generic type arguments. And we're going to ask for the first or default. I know this is going to get a little long, so I'll put that down to the next line. And we want to get the interfaces of each one of those generic types. And we're also, all we're looking for is where any of them might be related to the interface type. So we have to look for, first of all, is it a generic type? First of all. And this is where it starts getting a little complicated. We want the get generic type definition equals interface type. Okay, so now we can get rid of the variable that we declared, and from that, what I can now do is I can define whether, if we have a generic type, in other words, it's not equal to null, we can move all of this code, once again, into a predictable set of interfaces. So what we're going to see now is that when we load this up, we're going to see the user control, or generic user control, will have descriptions or more definition, whereas the other controller without the generic will not have any descriptions. So let's go ahead and run this. All right, we'll go into our Swagger. Okay, now we have set the summary for all of this here. So at the moment, that's not related to our examples. But if we look at post, we see that we haven't changed anything for RequestBody in the original. However, for the generic version, it now has, again, more detail around what a post looks like. And again, we can say that same thing for put. All right, so we know it's working. We just haven't got much context, and actually I should explain to you here, I didn't say this as well. So we have more context around what's the type here. So it says company for post, whereas up here it says nothing about company, it's just pretty much empty. All right, so let's go to the next step. So now that we know that we are getting some differences in our examples, we can move our summary and description down into this area here, where we're essentially saying that anything that's using our generic controller, we're going to define a consistent set of examples from this point, which is really helpful. Now, one of the things that we have not done is define some more context around the description. The description here, for example, is quite simple and for modifying or just displaying that there's some requirements, basic requirements. Now, that's not always true for all methods. So what we want to do is we're going to simplify our description so that at minimum it's going to display the summary. Okay, and in fact, we can make changes to both of these areas based on the method that it's going to be using. Okay, so I'm going to define essentially a basic type of description and summary, and then based on the method that's coming through, I'm going to modify it. So I'm going to say that the get summary is get all, let's see, get all generic type dot name company entities. Okay, and the description will basically be the same thing. So here we're just copying down the descriptions or the summary into the description. Now we will have a point as well where we're going to check for an ID parameter. That's the next step, so that we differentiate between what get one and get all means. For post, we have this is pretty straightforward here, but create a company entity. So if you remember way back, we said that we've got a context around just generic, and that was what we used in our XML commentary. Now we're getting more specific. So let's go into the put method. We can say that we are going to update a company entity. All right. And one of the things that we want to have here is I need to have it say that we have a requirement for our description. So the requirement that I have is requirements, and let's do this. So we're going to say the ID parameter and the generic type name dot ID in the request body must match. So with that, now we've got, again, more context around the operations of what's happening here. Finally, I'll just say this, to do the delete here, delete a company entity, and the description will be back down through there using the company summary once more. Now, I could provide more context around the ID must match these parameters. So, for example, let's do this here. Okay, the ID parameter must match an entity within the user context. So that would be true here in the case of a delete. It would also be requirement number 2 for the put. So I can't, in other words, I can't make a change to an entity that doesn't exist within my user context. So ID parameter must match an entity within the user context. Okay, ID parameters, yeah, I can just say ID must match, because essentially what we're saying here is that the ID parameter and ID must match, and it also has to be an ID within the user's context. All right, let's give this a try and we'll see what now comes up. We'll go under our Swagger. Okay, now let's start off at delete. So now we have ID parameter must match an entity within the user context. Not much else here that needs to be said. We can go into the put, and it has two requirements, so ID and company ID must match. And we've got our nice example. We've got our schema here. Pretty good so far. Get, you can see here where it's not giving us the proper get, because this one is for ID and it actually needs to return only one entity. So we will make some changes there. And let's see, we have create a company entity, looking good so far. Okay, very nice. And our get up here is also producing a decent looking description. Now, once more, you can add in more context. It's all up to you. You've got a lot of freedom there. Now, that last bit for producing the example. Now, for get, what we need to do is, in this case, we need to define whether we have an ID parameter. Now, that requires some simple stuff here. We have to determine whether an ID parameter actually exists. Now, on this case, what we're going to have it say is the default will be get all entities, okay? But we're going to ask for whether we have ID parameter, has ID parameter, and the way we do this is we go into context.api description dot parameter descriptions, okay, and we're going to basically look for a parameter with the same name as ID. Okay. Now, we've used this type of pattern before where we ask for equals, so we're saying name equals ID, string comparison, there we go, ignore the case, and something else that's a bit of a weird one, but it has to also be within the binding path. So p.source equals binding source dot path. Okay, and that essentially just means over here now where we have the binding path, this would be the binding path. Normally we would say bind, for example, and say here's the features that we expect to come in to this endpoint. All right, so if has ID parameter, then we want to make some changes. So I'm going to move this down here because essentially it's just going to pull in the summary, and we say get a single company entity. Nice and easy. So let's give this a try. All right, we'll go into our Swagger. So let's take a look at what we have here. So we have, for get with no parameters, we have get all company entities. Our post is create a company, and it should say and our get with an ID says get a single company entity. All right, now we've got the basics of what this needs to do. There's a few things that are obvious wrongs in what we're doing, and that is our examples. Our examples are all based on company. Now, one of the things that we can do in our examples here is we can provide that directly from an object. Okay, so we have an object of type, in this case it's a company. What we want to do, in fact, is say, hey company, what do you look like in this context? So in order to do that, we have to extend on what our objects actually do. So there's a few things that I like to do with this. One of them is I develop an interface here, and I'm going to call this swagger examples. Example modifier. That's what we'll call it. Okay. Now, the example modifier is fairly straightforward. And in this case, what we're doing here is we're going to be adding a few static fields. We want to have an example for a request example. So the static formation here essentially is it's going to accept a HTTP method. In other words, I'll give the HTTP method, and I can return back what that object is supposed to look like. So I can do this. Oops. I want to do a switch. Gotta spell right. Going a little quick here. HTTP method, and I'm going to convert that to upper just to be sure that I have it always correct. All right. So we have a get method. Once again, we've got all the same stuff that we expect here. Post, put, delete. All right. So with the get method, we don't have any requests, so we can actually return no. But you never know, you might need something, so you can actually provide something there. Post will have an object. Now it's an empty object at this moment, but once again, you can return something that you need as a base level. And we have delete as well. Now delete doesn't have anything usually, but once again, you can modify that as you see fit. And of course, we have for the default, let's just return no. So let's look at what we're trying to accomplish here again. So we're going to implement that interface on our company, for example. So here I'm going to do, I'm going to add the Swagger modifier here. And what I'm looking to accomplish is essentially copying this. Okay. Now I have that interface with static methods because I will use it in the future, so it will come through. But now, in an example for our API request, what we need to do here is actually tell it what does a post request look like. And in this case, I can say that it's very straightforward. I can say it's providing the name. Okay. Now for a put, I need to provide an ID. So something like that. The rest I don't have to provide anything for. So let's go down over to the examples here. So in this way, what I have is we have our JSON example, which is currently as empty. And what we're looking for here is now we're going to ask for whether we have that method on our example or our object, our generic type. Okay, so if our generic type actually has the example, we can query it and update that example as needed rather than specify it as a hard coded. Okay, so here we're using some reflection once more. So we're doing get method, and in this case we're doing name of, and it'll be, this is why we used our interface, because now we're saying name of API request or API example modifier, and it's an API request example, and it has to have the binding flags of public and binding flag static. Okay, if it finds that, if method info is not equal to null, then let's update our information here. So we have info or example request body, and we're going to invoke that method. So by invoking that method, we're actually calling into the object, and it's going to return back an object. We're going to convert that object to JSON. And it takes a couple of parameters here, fairly straightforward parameters. It takes the HTTP info or method. Okay, and that requires object, just like that. So reasonably straightforward. If it finds an example, okay, so here we say if body is not equal to null, then let's convert the result over to JSON. So we have our JSON example equals JSON serializer dot serialize, and we're going to take the example body and just convert it. So if again, if we have an example that's come through, it's going to carry down to our example and give us an example in our body. So let's give this a try and see how this works out. Actually, sorry, excuse me. We don't need these things anymore. We'll just remove that. Let's fix that now and we'll run it. All right, we'll go into our Swagger, and now we should see specific examples for post, which we do. We have now the same thing that we had before, but it's now a little more dynamic. Same with put. It's got more information there that we can actually consume. The get features does not have anything because it doesn't require it. And same up here. All right, amazing. Okay, so now I'm going to wrap up this video. I'm going to do another part for adding responses and modifying the schema. That'll be in part 10. I really appreciate everyone watching and hanging in there. This is a very long video. I hope it's informative. There's a lot of information here and a lot of great detail. I'm always excited to hear from you, so feel free to make a comment. Be kind, be gentle, but Make sure that you support the channel, subscribe, like the videos, share as often as you can. I really appreciate it, everyone. Love you all. Bye.